The next person to introduce tonight, uh, I feel has kind of an interesting story for us. You all know Congressman Warren Davidson. And when we were talking, Dan's group and our group, about celebrating America, 250 years, we've been doing this lead up month after month, marching on to July. We were talking about who is a really good speaker who understands the founder's blueprint, what they had in mind, and how it can guide our present and our plans for the future. The name we came up with was Congressman Warren Davidson, that he best understands if you listen to his speeches, if you read his writings. And of course, he's also a military man. He's done his own service. So when we requested that he come speak, we were delighted that he accepted, as he has accepted other invitations from us. But please give Congressman Warren Davidson from the 8th District a warm welcome.
Hey, thank you all so much. It's really an honor to join you, and what a great topic. The 250th, America's 250th birthday is next year. Pretty good. Little dry run this year for the parade with the Army. The Army's older than America. It took an Army to build America. And as our new Secretary of War highlighted, it's going to take an Army to continue to defend America. So we're back to having a strong and focused military, and hopefully we'll keep a strong and focused foreign policy. They are different. You want a military that's ready to fight and win wars, but a lot of times our foreign policies kind of drifted off course. We really haven't figured out exactly what to do since the end of the Cold War. And, that's a big part of how I decided, I'm going to have to get out of the Army. So I first enlisted in the Army, graduated high school in 88, enlisted, got sent over to Germany, and I was over there in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. Seeing people experience their first hours of freedom, it was pretty cool. From there, my chain of command helped me go to West Point. So that's not normally the way you go to West Point, but it's the way that worked for me. And at West Point, graduated there and then went back in the infantry, served in the Old Guard, 75th Ranger Regiment, and the 101st Airborne Division. And that's when I said, if I keep doing the Army, I'm going to be like a bitter, crusty old colonel. We are not focused on the things we should be focused on. The Ranger Regiment was, but in 1998, when Al Qaeda blew up America's embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, we didn't send the Ranger Regiment. Bill Clinton made that decision, and history's really different because of that. And those decisions have big consequences. Well, I came back to Ohio, got into manufacturing, and really built a nice small business. That's what I was doing when John Boehner, Speaker of the House, resigned as Speaker, but also as my member of Congress. And, a lot of the traditional candidates got in right away. And about a month later, Congressman Jim Jordan stopped by my office and was raising money to get more conservatives there. And I was like, yeah, count me in, happy to help. And he goes, well, hey, who are you going to back to replace Speaker Boehner? And I'm like, well, I don't know. You're Jim Jordan, not me. You tell me. And I'll take a look at him, as a donor. And he goes, well, it'd be good if there's an Army Ranger business guy in the race. And that was basically my reaction. I just laughed. And they told me who to make the check out to. And I went home and told my wife about my day, and I thought she would laugh. And she says, well, what'd you tell him? I said, well, I laughed because it's crazy. And she goes, no, it's not. You'd be great at that. I said, okay, well, let's talk about how crazy it is. And I listed off a few objections. And she goes, well, if we don't send different people, how's it ever going to change? And, I think ultimately we prayed about it, felt like we should get in. We got in 10 minutes before the filing deadline, which was December 15th-ish, 2015. Hard to believe that. I mean, that's closing in on 10 years ago. And so we won a 15-way primary and have been in office since June of 2016. So this is now my 5th term. They redrew the maps in this last election, and Ohio went from 16 members of Congress down to 15. And we went from 12 Republicans and 4 Democrats down to 10 Republicans and 5 Democrats. Well, I see that, look, if you want to have an honest election, you got to start with an honest census. And Donald Trump tried to have an honest census, but the court kind of threw his case out. We didn't get the case really adjudicated on the facts, and we're still fighting for that. I introduced in my first term a constitutional amendment so that we're clear that the purpose of the census is to count the U.S. citizens. I'm fine if you count the other people. I particularly want to know where the illegals are so we can deal with that issue too. But for apportionment of representation, to decide which states get how many seats, you got to count citizens. And as a member of Congress now, I represent U.S. citizens, and so do all my colleagues. Foreigners have representation in America at embassies and consulates. That's what ambassadors do. So, if we went over to, Ireland, we wouldn't feel like we had a member of the Irish Parliament represented us. We would go to the American embassy. And that's why somebody from another country should go to their embassy or consulate. And so, we don't need to be mean about it. If you're visiting here legally, I'm happy to direct you to your representation in America. It's not me. But, we currently have a system where we're counting anyone and everyone who's here, and that rewards sanctuary cities, that rewards sanctuary states. And so not only is it overrepresenting states like California, it's particularly representing the sanctuary cities because that's where the illegals are concentrated, even within California, is in the sanctuary cities. And so, we've got legislation dealing with that. We've got court cases pending dealing with that. And we've got a constitutional amendment dealing with that, but we haven't changed it. So in the meantime, we have congressional maps that are based, on the most recent census. President Trump, thankfully, has requested another census. So hopefully we get that done in either case, and we do it honestly, and we count who are the citizens, and we draw the map based on that. In the meantime, there are states that are redrawing their congressional maps. And the only one that I know of that's doing it because they have to is Ohio, because our Constitution says you have to redraw the maps, or at least you have to vote on them again. I guess they could resubmit the exact same maps, but our Constitution anticipates that sometimes redrawing the maps could become political. It's never okay to draw them on the basis of, race or whatever. That would be unconstitutional. When we amended our Constitution without saying the word Cincinnati, we basically said you can't split Cincinnati. So, that makes it, demographically more challenging than it used to be when you could split Cincinnati, and so on and so forth. There's some rules like that that are in the state constitution. But at the end of the day, if a majority of both parties had agreed back in 2022 to have the maps as presented, then the maps would be good for 10 years. But they didn't. Democrats felt like Republicans losing 2 seats and them getting 1 wasn't a good enough deal. So they said, no, thanks. We'll see you in 4 years. Well, now they're kind of a little buyer's remorse, and they're feeling like, oh, that's not good. We'll see what the state does. So the legislature looked at it. Right now, during the month of October, our redistricting commission has to look at the maps. And that involves it's equal representation for Republicans and Democrats, no matter what the size of the majority or minority is. You have the top Republican and top Democrat in the House, top Republican and top Democrat in the Senate. So that's 4 members. And then the other 3 are statewide, so you can't gerrymander statewide races. The governor, the Secretary of State, very important role, and the auditor of state. So currently Keith Faber, Frank LaRose, and Governor Mike DeWine, along with, the top 4 in the state Senate, state House. So they have to present a map by the end of October, and then the legislature is supposed to, quote, ratify that by the end of November. And then from that moment on until the first Wednesday in February, there will be court cases because there'll be challenged no matter what the outcome is. And then on the first Wednesday, that will be the filing deadline for whatever the districts are as of the date of the filing. Hopefully we'll have a little more certainty on that. My own view is my district's great. No need to change it. Back in the last census, I was like, my district's great, but I need 60,000 people from somewhere. They changed it pretty significantly. and we picked up the whole west side of Hamilton County. The 8th district, as long as it's existed, has always been Butler County, Preble County, and Dart County. And the 1st and 2nd district always split Hamilton. Now the 1st and 8th district split Hamilton. And so the west side of Hamilton County is the 8th district, the district I get to represent right now. And so literally everything west of 75 that isn't in the city or Delhi Township is in the 8th district. And we'll see whether they change that or move it. I've seen 7 or 8 variations on it. I don't know. I think there'll probably be some more changes up north, but we'll see. I think that it was a more fair representation of Ohio when we had 12 Republicans. And if we were going to lose one seat, it made sense that we would go with a Democrat in Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati. But I'm not part of the 7 people, right? So we'll see. As my mom, gave us peanut butter and jelly sandwiches or whatever when we were kids, my sister might get to cut the sandwich, but I get to pick which side. So we'll see where they draw the maps. All right. So they'll draw districts and I'll pick one of them, and we'll see how it goes. As for fair elections, Ohio's had a great saying for a long time. It should be, easy to vote and hard to cheat. But that's still a long ways off from the groundwork that President Trump has laid out for federal elections. And even though things went far better in Ohio in the last several elections than they went back in 2005, when Democrats protested Ohio's election. So on January 6th of 2000, this would have been, 2005, January 6th of 2005, the 2004 election, Democrats objected to Ohio's results. So you had Barbara Boxer from California and a Democrat from Cleveland say, this is unfair. John Kerry really should have won Ohio, and we can't trust the results in Ohio. And they objected to Ohio's results. And, just as Florida had some problems in the 2000 election, Ohio had some concerns about issues in the 2004 election. And since then, we've really done a lot of things. Our current state senator, John Husted, was Secretary of State, and he sued. He literally had to go to the United States Supreme Court to remove dead people from the voter rolls in Ohio. So that's how bad the Democrats were suing to keep dead people registered to vote in Ohio. We've been told by the controlled media that illegal aliens do not vote in American elections. And we just found out that the illegal alien who was hired to be the superintendent of schools in Des Moines, Iowa, was not only a registered voter in Maryland, he had a voting record where he had voted. He also didn't have the credentials he said he did, and he's here illegally, and so soon he won't be here anymore, and he'll be deported, which is good. But that highlights how important, election takers. If you listen to Brian Thomas this morning, I was talking to him about, a box of pre-printed ballots that were mailed to a regular voter in Maine. So these are the kinds of things that people say happened in the 2020 elections, where trucks literally showed up to polling locations in states like, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, places where they were so transparent, they kicked out the observers. And when they kicked out the observers, they put poster board over the windows. And, instead of stopping counting, they kept counting. And instead of the results staying in line with how they were, they went like 99-1 for Joe Biden. There's people that still say, we didn't have an honest election in 2020 and we need to correct a lot of things. President Trump is maybe the chief spokesperson for that. And he's laid out a host of things. Actually, we were just talking with the card that you see laying on your seat, and it lays out essentially what President Trump's laid out. In the House, we've done this as well. We've passed several pieces of legislation through the House, but we're running into the same thing that the Senate's running into, which is they need 60 votes. So we've passed in a simple majority a number of election integrity bills, and you can't get 60 votes, so they don't even come up for a vote in the Senate. And I want to pause talking about election integrity and a couple things that I was asked to talk about, and just give you a brief update on the current state of play for the CR. So most people know that the government is technically not fully funded right now. And most people probably didn't notice a ton of things changed about your day. You're like, well, the federal government's closed. You're like, well, that's kind of irresponsible. I got stuff to do today. And, the prisoners in the federal prisons are still being guarded by the prison guards. The military is still deployed all the places they're supposed to be. The FAA is still monitoring air traffic control. TSA agents are still patting down people and looking through everything and whatnot. So all the things that are typically going on are going on. And, so what does change? Well, if you look at the military, if we get to the middle of the month when they get paid, normally twice a month, they won't get paid. So if the military is deemed essential, I don't understand why the payroll clerk that would pay the military isn't also deemed essential. So there's a bill that deals with this. Senator Johnson from Wisconsin's the original author of it, and Dusty Johnson in the House is the House version, and it's called the Shutdown Prevention Act. It would basically correct anomalies like that and keep things running that are supposed to be running, keep people paid that are supposed to be paid. And we should have the debate. Right now, we're having the debate. I'm a little disappointed. My own view is we should have a government small enough to fit within the Constitution. We could actually afford a government that size, which is tell you we're at least $2 trillion off right now because we have about a $2 trillion deficit. So meanwhile, Democrats want $1.5 trillion worth of additional spending, which will, we're $3.5 trillion apart. Obviously not easy to reconcile that. So in the meantime, basically they're saying, okay, as you guys keep fighting this out, let's just continue the status quo and keep the government open. And that's what the bill is. This is the same level of funding that Democrats passed through the Senate and Joe Biden or the Otto Penn signed back in the previous Congress. And in March, that's what we passed. The original plan was we were going to do a Make America Great Again primer in March and do a pro-Trump funding plan. But then the SALT caucus kind of disrupted that, and we wound up with one big, beautiful bill instead of a two-step process. But here we are. We're still fighting over some of the things. Should we have more government or less government? Should we have more freedom or more government? These kinds of things. And all that the Republican leadership, President Trump, Speaker Johnson, and Senate Majority Leader Thune have said is, let's just keep the status quo going. And look, it's an honor to be on the punt team. I imagine in the NFL, if you're not a punter, you would prefer to be on, offense or defense. I'm sure it would be an honor to be in the NFL. And that's a little bit like what I feel like right now. It's an honor to be in Congress, but I didn't want to be on the punt team. I want to play some offense, right? We want to get back to a government small enough to fit in the Constitution. But we can't do that until we, resolve this conflict. So we passed a couple weeks ago a bill through the House that funds a CR, status quo funding, same funding levels, same policy riders and everything. And then it went to the Senate. And so far, the Senate has a majority that will pass it, but the Senate has a 60 vote rule. So they need 60 votes. The first time they voted, they got 2 Democrats, and then they voted a second time and they got 3 Democrats. And they didn't vote today because today's Yom Kippur. Happy holidays to all those who celebrate Yom Kippur. But tomorrow they'll be back in the Senate voting again. And so the hope is that eventually they'll get, Senate Democrats to go, all right, fine, we're going to keep the government open. So that's kind of the state of play. I'm going to take some questions at the end. You got questions about that or any other stuff we'll talk about? Well, I talked about election integrity. I talk a little bit next about, 2 other topics. And one is, border security. And you don't really need to say a whole lot more other than, President Trump's line at his State of the Union. Turns out all we needed was a different president. All right. Night and day, same laws. And, this is why I believe that a really just outcome would be that Alejandro Mayorkas, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, would be charged with treason. Right. And people say, oh, that's hyperbole. No, I admit I went to business school, not law school. But look, he took an oath of office to support and defend our Constitution, to faithfully execute the laws of our country. And he literally presided over a department that designed an app to help people come into our country illegally. I mean, they literally uninstalled detection systems at the border so they could detect who was crossing the border illegally. Not only did Congress pass an appropriations bill to fund a border wall, the president signed it. They had material. They were building construction. The job of the executive branch is to execute the law. They sold the stuff off. I mean, they got rid of it. So it is a complete betrayal. And there has to be accountability for that. And until there is, somebody will probably do it again if they ever get a chance. So in the meantime, I hope we keep winning elections, and election integrity is one of the key steps to doing that. The other part is, again, we don't want to be on the punt team. We want offense. So President Trump's doing all kinds of great things. We've passed through the House a number of great bills on border security, immigration reform, and that involves stopping illegals from being here, not like amnesty stuff. There's people that want to do that. We're not doing that. But the next thing is we need laws that actually make it so that any future president or secretary of Homeland Security, ICE agents that aren't going to do the duty are going to get in trouble. They will easily go to jail, and we won't have to wait until there's an election. We can just go to court and get the win to say, no, your job is to secure the border. It's not ambiguous. And I hope we get all the way on offense and pass these laws. And I recognize we need 60 votes in the Senate. We should at least make them vote. We've got all kinds of good bills where the House has passed them. You can check the recorded votes on those in the House. Republicans have been very united. But in the Senate, they haven't even voted. And they work like crazy to avoid voting. We need to get the recorded votes, and we can hold them accountable. And that's the point of the election. Sometimes, as my wife alluded to, and she was convincing me, if we don't send different people, how's it ever going to change? You don't need to update the SOPs. You need different personnel. And it's not a policy issue. It's a personnel issue. And on issue after issue, look, I'm a big movie buff. One of the standard questions is the original better than the sequel? And usually the original's better. Occasionally the sequel's better. In my view, Godfather 2 is better than Godfather 1. But 47 is the best sequel ever to 45. 45 was a great president. 47's awesome. I mean, I'm loving life with what President Trump's doing. We just have to get more on offense in the House. There isn't a whole lot more to say about the border security issues. It's going the right way with the executive branch. Question is, what is the House doing about it? And to be fair, Speaker Johnson has put the bills on the floor. They're passing the House. There's probably a few more offensive plays we could call, but they're going nowhere in the Senate anyway. And we'll see if we can get the pressure on the Senate to take them up. The last thing I was asked to talk to you about is sound money. So back in 2020, I created the Sound Money Caucus. Now, some people will say sound money is just another word for a gold bug. And, historically, gold has been one of the basic stores of value for money. Gold has backed payment systems as long as we've known about gold and payment systems. And if you think about the right to transact, this predates any government, right? So in a most basic formulation of government, you would say, don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. Cain killed Abel. And so since then, we've been pretty clear that, okay, we're going to have somebody adjudicate right and wrong. And people have a hard time completely living that way. Thankfully, most people live at peace, but some people have to break that principle. The one statement we have to add is, don't tolerate those people who do that. Pacifism really doesn't work because somebody breaks the principle. They will hurt somebody. They will take their stuff. And so you do have to have some law and order, impose it into society. But here's the trade-off, and it's as old as Ben Franklin's observation with the Constitution is, trading, liberty for security. And it's a terrible trade. He said you'll wind up with neither. And that's what we're doing. I mean, you go back to the Patriot Act, Ron Paul and a handful of others said this is going to be abused against you. And shame on us. We haven't learned our lesson. We're still continuing to add more surveillance. One of the base things that happened is your right to transact was infringed. So if you think about the state of nature, just like when Cain and Abel were getting along fine, Cain was, mad. He's growing vegetables, and Abel was growing meat. And, God liked the meat, and Cain was jealous. And so if you want to trade some meat for some vegetables, you could work it out, right? If you think about, if you got fish and fruit, and you got fish and I got fruit, we trade it. And, somebody says, hey, what you guys doing there? We'd say, well, that's a little nosy. We're just trading some stuff over here. Well, now the government feels like they want to surveil every transaction you're in. And this goes back to the 70s with the Bank Secrecy Act. And essentially, not only in our country, but in countries around the world, if the banks don't spy on their customers, they don't get to be banks. But the level of spying is off the charts, and the technology to do it is more and more sophisticated. So along the way, the money has been corrupted. And when you look at every dystopian fiction out there, whether it's, Brave New World, 1984, Fahrenheit, uh, or what I say, Scripture, Revelation, um, the money's corrupted into a tool for surveillance and coercion and control instead of its proper use, which is a store of value and a means of exchange. Well, when it's gold, it's a stable store of value, right? It's worth so much gold. And right now, our money is being debased. And back in 2020, when they closed the economy, pandemic risk is, there's a pandemic and you decide, I don't know if I want to go out to a group like this tonight. I think I'll just watch it online. That's pandemic risk. But we had political risk where the government said, you can't meet, you can't gather. If you do gather, you have to do this, that, and everything else. So we had all this political risk going on, and it effectively closed large parts of the country, large parts of the planet, large parts of our economy. And at the same time, the government's reaction was, let's inject massive amounts of government spending into the economy. Like how much? I don't know, like a month of GDP, because we should close the planet for a month. I'm like, wow, that seems crazy. And then I called or actually a business guy was calling me. He's like, look, I have a hotel, and the government told me I have to close. And for good measure, they put physical barricades up so customers couldn't come to my hotel. And like, I shouldn't have to, like, this isn't normal risk. Like, this is a taking. And I'm like, well, I mean, I kind of agree with you on that first one. But then I realized, like, no, they're going to use this over and over again. And they're not going to, it's like heroin. They're hooked on it and they're going to keep doing it. This is going to cause massive inflation. And so I created the Sound Money Caucus. And I illustrate what is sound money. Historically, governments have failed because they debased the currency. The Roman Empire had people that would clip the coins, and it was using some form of metal. When you say silver, they would clip the silver. They'd keep a little bit of it, but the coin's supposed to be, let's say an ounce of silver, and now it's not an ounce because somebody took a little bit of the silver off and sold it. So it kept getting debased. We debased the currency in a little different way, and the most basic thing is, if you could just add more money, then all the existing money is inherently worth a little bit less because the economy is worth exactly what it was before. In some cases, the economy is worth less than it was before, which is why the reaction is that we just inject more spending into it. So that makes the inflation even worse. And, Milton Friedman, his Nobel Prize in economics is for this observation. He didn't just note that it started happening in the 70s, but he got the Nobel Prize in the early 70s, I think in 72, for what he called the quantity theory of money. So inflation means you grow the money supply, M1, M2, and when you put more money in the economy, it dilutes the value of it. But then what happens next is asset prices get inflated. And for those of us that have assets, let's say we're homeowners, or maybe you've saved for retirement and you have a 401k or something like that, stocks or bonds. Those assets, not everybody has, but those of you with assets, you're like, stock market's up. House values are up. I got my property tax statement. It says my property's worth a whole lot. You're like, well, I'm not really sure it's worth that much, but okay. At least your property value is going up. And you feel like, well, inflation isn't terrible for me. But for the people that don't have the assets, they're getting wrecked. They don't have savings. They might be early young people starting out, or they might be seniors that didn't have the savings, living on a fixed income, and they're getting wrecked because the money just doesn't buy as much as it used to. And they didn't have the rising tide lift their boat because they didn't have asset prices to get inflated. And that's where it shows up. And people have a hard time with this cause and effect relationship. And that's why governments continue to do it. The inflation is a form of theft. If you think about like how much your grocery prices have gone up, roughly 20, 25%, or, the best illustration to me is like Subway, because they used to have these ads, pretty catchy jingle, $5 footlongs. I think footlongs are like $12 right now, right? Like, okay, it's still the same footlong, the same sandwich. It costs more than double what it used to. It's the same sandwich. So your money is worth less. And that's the root issue. Think if we put a $5 tax on sandwiches. I mean, people would have us all fired. They'd be like, this is crazy. We're going to put a giant tax on all your groceries. Normally in Ohio, sales tax aren't even charged on groceries. So we said, no, we're going to put a 25% tax on groceries. Yeah, you guys are crazy. Or get out of here. Well, they don't have the integrity to put the tax on. They don't have the integrity to pay for the spending. So you get excessive spending and it shows up as inflation. And people fall for all kinds of other explanations like, well, it's corporate greed. Well, weren't corporations just as anxious to make money before as they are now? They would always prefer more profit to less profit. So what changed? And so this summer I got the chance to go down to Argentina and I met with Javier Milei. And we had a bipartisan congressional delegation, or CODEL for short. A CODEL is always bipartisan. And I was able to ask him, amongst Republicans and Democrats, have you figured out what causes the inflation? And he just laughed and he's like, well, obviously government spending. And, we had deficits as big as 6% of our GDP. And for reference, Argentina's GDP is like, not as big as Ohio's GDP. But the US GDP, we have deficits of over 6% right now. So their deficits were similar to ours. But where we generally, people will say in a per year basis, our inflation's now about 3%. He was having 8% inflation per month. So think how crazy out of control that was. And so people were choosing to not get paid in Argentinian pesos. They wanted dollars. They were switching to cryptocurrency. There was all kinds of instability. And he came into office and he said, most people in politics make the utilitarian arguments. They tend to say, let's go incremental. We got an election coming up. We need to grow the majority. And they never really get around to doing the things they believe in. They make the utilitarian incremental case. So we were in a situation where let's just do the moral thing. Let's do what is right and just. And we know that the central bank should float the currency. We know that the central bank shouldn't monetize the debt. And by monetize the debt, that means when there's no buyers at an interest rate, let's say currently about 4% for the 10-year Treasury, and they say, well, there's not enough buyers, well, then the Federal Reserve will buy them. And back during COVID, when all this stuff was going on, I met with Jerome Powell. I had questioned him at a hearing, and he said, well, this isn't going to cause inflation. I said it would. He said, well, it won't hit consumers. I said it would. He said, well, it'll be transitory. And I said, let's talk. So we talked, and he came to my office. I figured it'd be a short little 20-minute meeting. We talked for about an hour and a half. And one of the things he said is, what are we supposed to do? Not cover for you, i.e. not cover for Congress. You guys are spending like crazy. I said, well, A, you could at least not call for more spending, which would be helpful. But B, yeah, that would be exactly what you do. You don't cover. That would be an independent Federal Reserve. You would let the rates move. You would not monetize the debt. And what do you mean when you monetize the debt? Well, prior to the 08-09 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve didn't even have $1 trillion worth of assets on its balance sheet. They basically cleared payments. And so they didn't hold assets. They just cleared payments. So they had a net positive balance, but they were basically settling payments between other banks. And that's one of the reasons to have a central bank. But in 08-09, they decided to do, you remember the phrase quantitative easing? Well, what that meant is they're going to cover for massive spending by the federal government. And so that the market rates don't go up, they're going to buy the treasuries. And so this debased the currency even more. And they grew their balance sheet to about $4.5 trillion. So of the debt at that time, which was about $9 or $10 trillion for the federal government back when the Tea Party movement was rolling, and the 2012 election was coming along, and we said, boy, we can't sustain these deficits. They had roughly half of the debt at the Fed. So today, the Federal Reserve has shrunk its balance sheet a little bit since the peak of COVID, but during COVID, they took it to over $9 trillion. So if you look in a way as a percent of GDP, they went down because we're at 37 trillion, and so they're at about 8.5 trillion on their balance sheet. So they still have a massive amount of debt. They essentially doubled the size of their balance sheet. But our level of debt has grown even faster. We're adding $1 trillion of debt every month to our deficit, and there's no end in sight. The last time that the planet had as much debt as we had right now, as a percent of our economy, percent of our GDP, was at the end of World War II. It was, between 125% of the economy and 130%. And we knew at the end of the World War II, we got to spend less money. So they started paying it down. They aggressively did it. Part of the reason Eisenhower said, let's settle things in Korea instead of fight another war, is so we wouldn't go and amp up the spending too much. Well, one of the places that I would say we could point Ukraine to is Korea. They still haven't fully resolved where the border should be, but they got tired of dying and killing each other. And they said, let's just draw the line here. And they've lived at peace since. And I hope that the Ukrainians do that. But the United States should absolutely say, look, we're not going to keep bankrupting our country by depleting the treasury. And we're not hurting our people, because when you grow the wealth gap, when you debase the currency, when you have massive inflation, it causes social division, and it is easy for people who aren't having their assets inflated to say, oh, it's because we're not taxing the rich. Well, the wealth gap didn't grow because you're taxing or not taxing the rich. The wealth gap grew because you destroyed the money. And we continue to wrestle with that challenge. We have to get back to sound money. To me, sound money is absolutely essential to defending freedom, and the right to transact should be one of the protected parts of the Bill of Rights. And the government's solution to these things is not rational. I mean, you would say, well, if we raise taxes enough, we could pay for the spending. The downside is you tend to raise taxes too much, and it actually slows the economic growth rate. We've seen Republicans and Democrats, going back to JFK and others, say, if we cut taxes some, we'll see the growth of the economy go, and so the total revenue will actually go up. And that's actually what happened in 2017. We passed the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, massive amounts of cash that was held offshore because our corporate tax rates were very not competitive. Even Budweiser is not an American company anymore. All you heard about was corporate inversions. We were probably a few business cycles away from McDonald's and Coke being Irish or something, because they had a 12% tax rate, right? And so lots of the cash was held there. Well, we quit talking about all that because we made our tax rates competitive. But the total receipts for the federal government grew, but this problem is the spending grew even more. So if you go back to George H.W. Bush, he would have lost anyway because Ross Perot took enough votes from him to guarantee that that George H.W. Bush wasn't going to win. But one of the things he's commonly cited for losing for is he broke his pledge. He said, read my lips, no new taxes. But I will say, at least he believed that if I'm going to spend the money, I should pay for it. He should have paid for it by cutting it somewhere else, but he didn't, and he raised taxes. Well, fast forward to the War on Terror, and Dick Cheney had a quote where he said, Reagan proved deficits don't matter. Well, no, he didn't. Reagan proved that you could take on debt to win a war. In this case, it was a Cold War, but normally, after you win the war, you spend less money. And that's exactly the kinds of things Bill Clinton talked about. He said a peace dividend. We shrunk from 18 divisions in the Army down to 10. We shrank from a 600 ship Navy fleet to 300 ships. Now we don't even have 300 ships. Readiness in the Navy is a big problem. And you saw Hegseth talked about readiness in the whole Department of Defense, or now the Department of War again. But you had the priority to balance the budget, and the last time we balanced the budget was 1999. This was, bipartisan lingo. But post 9/11, the framework totally shifted, and part of it was, the neoconservative wing of the country's politics. People like Dick Cheney and John Bolton and others that basically want more wars in more places. The same defense industrial complex that Dwight Eisenhower talked about. And so in his famous farewell speech, Dwight Eisenhower cautioned about the military industrial complex, but he also cautioned about the scientific technical elite, people like Fauci, people that would put their own interest in the truth at odds with America's and essentially demand unlimited spending, which is clearly not in America's interest. It's not in your interest, not in the constituents' interest. It's debasing the money. And we have to get back to that idea that no one proved that the deficits don't matter. Deficits do matter. And if deficits didn't matter, why would you even bother collecting taxes? You should just print the money, right? They clearly matter. And that's my piece for sound money. You have to get back to something that is balanced. And in my view, the path back, and I'll close and just take questions if you got any, and if we got time left. And that's if we restore a government small enough to fit in the Constitution, way less government, more freedom, less government, sound money, secure borders, and strong families, we could afford a government that operated that way. And we don't have a government that operates that way. And that's why we should be voting for less government by November 20th. Right now, President Trump called me and said, hey, we're gonna need your vote on the CR. All right, Mr. President, what's the plan to get less government? Well, Russ Vote's gonna fight for it, and we're gonna get the Democrats. They want more government. We got to win the votes. I'm like, okay, we'll win the votes. And I will say my colleagues are staying the course. Chuck Schumer wants 1.5 trillion. A lot of us want less government, but we know our economy needs less government. We're overdosing on government right now, just like Argentina was. And we have to take corrective action or we're going to arrive at the crash site. So hopefully we don't. Hopefully we take action. And, that's my talk on three things. Thanks for having me.
Questions?
I'm for the tariffs. I'm for everything President Trump's been doing, but is that going to help at all with the deficit, or is it just a drop in the bucket?
No, that's pretty substantial. I mean, we're bringing 30 to 35 billion dollars a month in right now in revenue from the tariffs, and that's all going straight into the Treasury. It's holding down the rate we're borrowing, and so we were supposed to have to, spend about $1 trillion in interest this year. We're still going to have to spend about $1 trillion in interest, but roughly a third of it's getting paid for by tariffs, which is huge. I mean, that's a win.
Here's a question.
Yeah, I've got way too many questions about the Federal Reserve, the banking system, etc. I'm a recovering accountant. Like you raise your hand. Hi, Tom. I'm an alcohol. I'm Tom. I'm an accountant. I'm Tom, and I'm an accountant. So I'll just roll it up into one question. It seems like the Federal Reserve. It doesn't seem like. I think if you went back and looked at 30, 40, 50 years of their actions, what they tried to do and what happened in the economy, they pretty much failed a lot. And if they have the power to do that quantitative easing, if that's, I guess it's legal. Nobody challenged it. They did it. That seems like an awful lot of power to give to a quasi-government. They're really not directly a part of the U.S. government. They're a quasi-governmental created by Congress, but they're a creature off on their own. Can bumpers be put in place? Restrictions? Can laws be passed to restrict what they can do to limit their damage?
I think a lot of it's like all central planning. Usually the central planners aren't accurate enough to outperform the market. And central bank is the kind of mutually agreed upon central planner for at least part of the economy. And it doesn't have to be that way. And I'll say, look, the single best use case for a central bank, and even this central bank, came to me in March of 2020. So when they closed the planet's economy, everything was in free fall. If you look there for about 10 days, things were in total free fall in the market. Everyone was panicking, selling off everything. Markets work when there's a buyer and a seller. But because people wanted the flexibility of cash, there was no buyer at any price. Like for Ohio State municipal bond, like Ohio State couldn't find a buyer for bonds. And it's like, well, Ohio State's not going to default on the debt. And to be fair, most people weren't concerned that they would default on the debt. They just didn't want to tie up cash for a 10-year bond at any price. They wanted the cash. So I talked with a hedge fund manager, and he's like, "Look, we do conservative stuff like buy Ohio State municipal bonds, but we do it with debt. We'll put 50%. So if we're going to buy $10 million worth of Ohio State bonds, we'll put 5 million of our cash in, and we'll take a loan on margin for $5 million. But if the value of them drops, to $8 million, well, we got to come up with $1 million to cover the margin call." And he's like, "We've had over $500 million of margin calls just in the past week and a half. Like we're dying." And roughly a dozen funds went bankrupt in that week. And, I'm not saying they break out the violin for the hedge funds out there, but it was a big problem. And I was on the phone with Mark Meadows, who was chief of staff then, and Steve Mnuchin. Overnight, they put in what was known as the Municipal Liquidity Fund, which was a backstop. They didn't make the loans, but they guaranteed the loans. And that created a backstop. And it allowed the bond market to function again. There were buyers at some price. And to me, that's all they should have done. And certainly by late April, early May, they were fine. But all through that summer, they were still loading up on treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, and they were monetizing the debt, right? They were distorting the economy. And that's when I talked to Powell in the wake of that conversation. I was like, okay, I have to create Sound Money Caucus. So I think, can we do it? Yes. I mean, the old Bill Cosby line, we brought you into this world, we'll take you out. But President Trump's having this feud mostly about whether he can fire one of the Federal Reserve board members. But he's also got an executive order that says that the United States will not develop a central bank digital currency. Well, the Federal Reserve has literally been writing code and programming a central bank digital currency. They've got, we've got positions where they're hiring people to do it. And the question is, what did we create? There's a really good book, widely known, The Creature of Jekyll Island, 1913. The Federal Reserve was created. Some people say that's when, Make America Great Again. Well, we go back to pre-Jekyll Island. But I say, we at least have to end this Fed. And one of the things we have to do with this Fed is make it so that the rates float and they can't monetize the debt. But I think that's going to get resolved this year, because if the president, if the Federal Reserve board members can't be fired by the president, then are they really part of the executive branch? If they're part of the executive branch, and I've asked Michael Horowitz, who's now the Inspector General for the Federal Reserve, to investigate, are they complying with the president's executive order to not develop a central bank digital currency? Did they stop working on it? And we know they didn't, right? So then the question is, well, okay, Congress, you created this Jekyll Island creature here. What are you going to do about it? And I think we have to put the same guardrails that you're talking about in. They might be a little different, but we definitely have to put some checks and balances on the Federal Reserve. And then the last thing, we created them to be the central bank. We didn't create them to be a bank regulator. They claim for themselves the power of being a bank regulator, and they're driving a lot of the bank regulatory policy. Normally, if we have bank regulators, they're on appropriations, so they at least kind of listen to Congress. The Federal Reserve will come to the annual hearing that they're required to, but they don't steer. They just do what they want. And so I've got a bill for a long time that would take the regulatory side of the Federal Reserve and put them on appropriations. And we would truly, at that sense, have a truly different Federal Reserve than the one we have today if we got to that.
We have a question here. So I've been listening to some Fox News, and it was mentioned that during the government shutdown that President Trump could put some Doge things into place and cut programs. And how permanent would that be?
Well, yeah. So what can the president do? And really the role is managed by the director of the Office of Management and Budget, currently Russ Vought. And there's a bill called the Anti-Deficiency Act. So government's not supposed to spend funds without an appropriation from Congress. And when it's expired, then there's limitations on, is it essential for essentially life, liberty, or property? We're not going to stop guarding the federal prisons, for example. They're going to do certain things. Well, I think that what's going to happen is if the Democrats keep the government shut down, Russ Vote's going to look at what the executive branch considers essential, and they've already done that work. They've prepared a budget recommendation. They think, hey, both between DOGE and their own review, hey, there's parts of government we need less of. There's parts of government we might need more of. They won't be able to do anything about the more. But they can go, yeah, we don't even need this whole department, so we could turn that off. And we don't just need to tell you to work from home. We can just tell you, hey, you can stop working here. We don't need you anymore. And I think, I'm sure that'll be sued in court, but I think that complies with the Anti-Deficiency Act, and so do a lot of other people. So,
Question right back here.
I have a daughter in London, and that communist prime minister over there is talking about instituting a digital ID. What can you tell us about the possibility of that happening here?
yeah, so Keir Starmer, their current prime minister, is talking about implementing a digital ID. I think it's noteworthy that the leader of the company that is supposedly going to implement the digital ID for the United Kingdom is Ewan Blair. His dad is Tony Blair, former prime minister for the UK. I think it's also worth noting that one of the companies that they're working with to develop this is Oracle, and Larry Ellison, the second wealthiest man in the world, is an American, and in the United States, he's a big supporter for Republicans, so we think of him as a Republican here. But in the UK, he's kind of a Labor Party guy. But either way, he does a lot of data management. So he's building some of the architecture. He also, in the United States, popular provisions of the big, beautiful bill was an AI blanket exemption from any regulatory action. Well, we do need an AI bill, but that's not what we need. We need things. And to be clear, AI doesn't create the database. AI is a language model, goes out and harvests that data that's held everywhere else. And Palantir, which is a defense contractor, has the assignment not to build a database. They're an AI company. They go out and crawl through all the existing databases, and they index that information so that no one human could really figure out every single thing the government would know about everything. But the AI models are getting pretty good at this. And so now anything that could be exploited by the Patriot Act just to keep us safe, Palantir will do. And some people are saying that's a great thing. And if all men were angels, I would agree. But the founders addressed that in a great Federalist paper. All men aren't angels. And so that's one of the concerns, and I'm working to get a meeting there. We need to take action in our own country on it. And in my view, you do have some balance between safety and security. If you've got online people making credible threats to a 31-year-old free speech advocate, you want to be able to rapidly go, what is the nature of this threat, and take action. But on the other side, if you're saying, what did Ben Thaler, who's with me there in the back, search for or buy from Amazon? Well, no, you need a warrant for that. Those are the safeguards. But the reality is, with artificial intelligence combined with the fact that we don't have a good privacy law, and so I shared it a little while back, but an op-ed. We need a base layer of privacy in the United States. The base layer of privacy in the European Union and in the UK is you don't really have any privacy, and you're being exploited and censored, which is essentially what the Democrats were doing in the United States. But they didn't get turned off. In the United States, we got that turned off. In Europe, they didn't. And that was the heart of J.D. Vance's Munich speech, where he's like, what are we defending here? And I was earlier this year in Hungary, and you had people from the UK, from Germany, from even Poland that were in Hungary for asylum because they were putting people in jail for speech. So, I mean, this is a real challenge. And to me, it's like, yeah, what are we defending with NATO? Why are we pulling security for you guys to be, bad people?
We have
And,
another question here.
It's going to be a challenge.
You were sound money advocates. You mentioned gold. What about digital currency? Do you consider that sound money?
Yeah. What currency would be considered sound? To me, honestly, if you had a gold-backed stablecoin, which there are, Paxos Gold, Tether's got a gold-backed stablecoin. This is a token that's digital, and it doesn't represent futures contracts or derivatives or anything else. There's literally gold in a vault, and let's say somebody had 100,000 ounces of gold. They would sell a claim to that ounce of gold. The gold never leaves the vault, but the digital claim moves. That's obviously sound money because it's essentially just tokenized gold. In my view, Bitcoin is sound money. I think the biggest weakness of Bitcoin is this phrase HODL. Some of you might not have heard much about Bitcoin or you know the word or phrase, but don't necessarily understand it. But you might not know what HODL means. It's an acronym for hold on for dear life. All right. So there's been some volatility, but there's like only ever going to be 21 million Bitcoin, and roughly 20 million of them have already been mined. There's about 1 million more left to be mined. And if you read the Bitcoin white paper, which you can read at bitcoin.org, it's pretty short, but it is technical. Just read the base abstract. It assumes the goal was to protect a permissionless peer-to-peer payment system. Well, payment systems only work if there's liquidity, which is you're willing to part with some of your Bitcoin. And the reality is the hold on for dear lifer people have mostly succeeded in turning it into an inflating asset against a deflating currency, and it isn't functioning as a currency. So I don't know that I could truly say that it meets the full criteria, but it is a store of value. It's actually been an appreciating value, but there's not enough liquidity where it's an efficient means of exchange. They're trying to bridge that by having things like the Lightning Network, and a really good book, if you want to read it on the subject and on money in general, is the Bitcoin Standard. And so I'd recommend that book.
We have an online question back here.
Somebody's asking, do we have an estimate of what it costs the country annually? Illegal immigration costs us annually.
I mean, there are a lot of estimates. The one I trust is the former chairman of Homeland Security said that his estimate from the work in the committee was about $350 billion a year.
We have another question here.
Yeah, since the government is currently shut down, does that mean we don't have to pay taxes?
I don't recommend that. The IRS, look, we did stop them from getting 87,000 additional agents, but they already have more than 80,000 agents currently. And for reference, 87,000 agents is roughly 5 infantry divisions worth of agents. So, that'll tell you we have way too complicated of a tax code. Nevertheless, somebody will eventually try to enforce it. I'd say you should probably pay your tax.
Could I ask a question real quick, Congressman, right here?
Yes, sir.
First of all, I want everybody to give Ben in the back a round of applause, too. He's been so great to work with us over the years. Thank you for coming, Ben. So I think I've got this story right. The big, beautiful bill, when it came out, you were one originally that kind of voiced opposition to it. Maybe one of 7 or 8 or 9 who voted against it. Do I have that right?
Well, technically all the Democrats voted against it. So there are a lot that voted against it. There are only 2 Republicans in the House that voted against it, Thomas Massie and me. And if a lot of people that were pretty upset about it, they know it was Trump's priority. Well, they didn't really know all the details. It is a really big bill.
Well, what I want you to know is I was applauding you a little bit. So thank you for that. But if I was a fly on the wall, what could you tell us a little bit about what happened to change your vote on that?
Yeah, so I told them, look, if this is the vote I cast in the House, I'm not voting for it. So, the lead up to the big, beautiful bill, look, in December of last year, we had a plan to do a CR, but only till March, right? And the goal was to do a quick hit on Trump's priorities in the first 100 days. So we could do a plus up for border security, a plus up for defense, and then raise the debt limit. And then we could have the broader fight as part of this appropriations process ahead of September 30th. And the moderates decided that they were going to form a SALT caucus, state and local taxes. So states like New York or New Jersey, they have like ridiculous high taxes. And so even somebody that's making like $80,000 or $90,000 a year, it's not uncommon for them to be spending $20,000 a year in state and local taxes. So they're getting wrecked. I have no idea why people live there. Some of the states are pretty, you know, California, beautiful state to visit, but their taxes are insane. Well, some of the moderates said, look, we got to stick together. And unless we get one bill, we're not voting for it. And normally that's how we get the omnibus. One big bill. It's always one big, beautiful bill. The way that you buy off the $37 trillion worth of debt is there's a bipartisan consensus. The Democrats all want more government, and some of the Republicans want more government. Now, we know generally during election season to campaign a smaller, more accountable government, but you might have noticed some of my colleagues don't mean it, right? And so there's always this consensus where they say, look, the real threat to us is these conservatives that want less government. So let's work together and get more government. And that's essentially what happened is we couldn't get rid of the SALT. The SALT went from $10,000 to $40,000 in deductible state and local taxes. And just during Trump's presidency till 2029, this was going to cost us about $350 billion, right? So I'm like, look, I want to help my colleagues in New York come back. Let's give them a win. The $20,000 is a win, you know? So Trump wore them out. They still didn't move. And I'm like, look, we got to do stuff about some of those kinds of wins. I didn't like the AI provision. I didn't like a lot of other things in there. There's a lot of things that get kind of in the weeds. But fundamentally, I said, you got to give me a reason to vote for it. I'm just going to be no. You know, Massey's going to be no because he only votes for less government, and this isn't less government, so he's going to vote no. So you can only really lose one other person. I want to vote for it, but give me a reason. And so I worked with Senator Rick Scott. I'll give kudos to him. For some of you, he might be your home state senator because you want to spend 180 days or more in Florida. But he's one of the senators from Florida, and he started hosting a dinner back, a while ago with conservatives from the House and Senate and trying to get us to work together for something that could be effective. And good friends with Susie Wiles, who's the president's chief of staff. And so that's where, where some people got lit up by President Trump for not supporting the agenda. I didn't get lit up much by the president himself. And nor did, Senator Rick Scott, nor did Ron Johnson, nor did Mike Lee, because we were working to kind of broker a better bill. And so it did improve during this Congress and during President Trump's term. It's still not a great bill. And part of it was we kept some of the Green New Deal stuff going. No Republicans voted for it. This is kind of the same kind of stuff as Obamacare, where no Republican voted for it. But now, oh, boy, you can't take that away. And that's why Republican politics is like NASCAR. Everyone gets in the race, they start turning left. Right. Anyway, they gave me a couple wins, and that's how I got the yes. And the other part is if in May we would have done, if we could have killed the bill, it would have reset us back to. We have one guy in the back there that I want to get to. Is we could have got two. We could have got two bills still in May, but by the July 4th deadline, President Trump said there's clear that we were no chance to do a better option. So it's like, well, we're not going to default on the debt. We're not going to run the debt limit. And I'm also not going to leave, President Trump hanging on what he became his signature bill. And okay, fine. It's not a perfect bill, but it is better than the status quo. We got some of the reforms we needed. Like if you're illegal, you're not supposed to get your neighbor's money for health care because you're not even supposed to be our neighbor. You're not supposed to be here. If you're able-bodied, working age adult, just like you would for your friends and family, eventually you got to go get a job.
Thank
you. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks a lot.